Welcome everybody. My name is Lena Kästner. I'm going to give you a quick introduction into how the lecture Introduction to the Philosophy of Science is going to be run this semester. Before I go into the logistics, however, I'm going to introduce the course to you and give you a little bit of an idea what kinds of things we'll be concerned with throughout the lecture and what material we'll be covering. Before we get started, do you know who this guy is? Has anyone seen him before? He's Gregor Johann Mendel. What has he done? Well, maybe some of you know this because he actually got famous for this work and you might have heard it in high school. Between 1856 and 1863, Gregor Mendel cultivated and tested some 29,000 pea plants. But the question I want to ask you is why? Why did he do that? Well, for one thing, Mendel was interested in heredity. He tried to explain how traits are passed on from generation to generation, and he studied 7 traits that seemed, so he observed, to be inherited independently of the other traits in pea plants. Those were seed shape, flower color, the coat tint of the seed, the pod shape, the unripe pod color, the flower location, and the plant height. Well, why did he study peas rather than anything else? So that's another kind of answer you could give to this question, why did he study pea plants? Well, to tell you a bit of an anecdote, he actually began his studies on heredity using mice, but he was at the Abbey of St. Thomas at the time, and his bishop wasn't very keen on him using animal sex and studying animal sex, so Mendel had to switch to plants. What does this example show? Well, I'm telling you this story because it's indicative of the kinds of things that philosophy of science is about. It's about observation, it's about explanation and experimentation. Scientists aim to explain what they observe in the world in order to be able to predict and control it. They aim to discover general principles, call them laws or mechanisms, that govern or bring about the phenomena they see in order to understand what's going on in the world, i.e. to make scientific progress. Mendelian inheritance was a milestone at the time, as are quantum mechanics, rocket science, or nanotechnology today. Meanwhile, scientists have discovered many awesome things. That the Earth revolves around the Sun, that there once was water on Mars, and that the heart pumps blood through the body. They found that there are about 86 billion neurons in each of our brains and that bananas actually have more genes than humans. They found ways to take pictures of black holes to control diseases with vaccines and antibiotics. But how exactly does science work? This is one of the questions in philosophy of science. Philosophy of science is concerned with how scientists come up with scientific theories or explanations for the phenomena we observe and solutions to present problems. But what kinds of things do scientists do to uncover, say, how vertebrate vision works or how the yearly seasons come about? When do they consider an explanation successful? What makes for a scientific theory? Do scientific experiments show us what the world is really like? And do scientific explanations approximate an objective reality or truth? Moreover, how do scientists draw conclusions from data they gather? What role do laws of nature play in scientific inquiry? What might be the relation between higher level, for instance, mental entities, studied in the special sciences such as psychology, and lower level entities such as particles, studied in physics or biology? And what counts as a proper science to begin with? These are the kinds of questions philosophers of science engage with. Throughout this introductory lecture, we'll encounter both traditional and contemporary discussions within this exciting field. Why are these questions worth worrying about, you might wonder? Or why should we bother about them? Why is it interesting to be a philosopher of science? Well, because scientific insights are the foundation of our modern daily lives. From medical care, for instance, knowing how the coronavirus spreads, to smartphones, Siri bringing you home without getting lost, to climate research, hopefully enabling us to keep the planet cool enough to survive. But why, you might wonder, does this take philosophy at all? Well, here's an anecdote. Back in 2010, I worked in a neurolinguistics lab studying cortical sign language processing. Here you see what's activated in sign language processing in your brain. Well, or in a sinus brain, rather. You can see the classic left hemispheric language network being active, marked in red and yellow here. And you also see some visual areas, especially towards the back of the brain here. Those are occipital areas. I find it really intriguing that the brain doesn't seem to care too much whether you see or hear language, though reading is different. So this is just language as in heard or seen language. And in the lab meeting, when we discussed the design of our new study, we also discussed how we might analyze the data. I was a student back then and very hesitant to ask a seemingly very stupid question, namely, why do we use those parameters in the data analysis? When I finally resolved to ask that question, I was really struck by the answer. Because that's what we did in the other study, and it gave us the best, aka most publishable or most colorful results. I was very disappointed at this point. But I'm not telling you this to get pitied. Rather, what I want to highlight is the importance of philosophy of science here. Because philosophy of science allows us to raise such questions as, what's the basis for scientific knowledge and inference? What is validated scientific knowledge that we can rely upon? What are legitimate inferences? It allows us to take a meta-scientific perspective, making connections and integrating fields. It also helps with conceptual clarifications. For instance, in biology, clarification on what actually a gene is was very helpful. Also, discussions about what qualifies as stem cells are really important to drive science forward. And last but not least, it's also reflections about values and norms and standards of scientific practice that philosophers can help with. And those are things that philosophy and science can contribute to scientific practice. So that said, let's look briefly into what the class is going to be covering over the semester. In the first session, we're going to be looking at what science is. So we're going to be talking a little bit about scientific inference, as well as the beginnings of science, modern science in Europe, and philosophy of science as well. Then in the second week, we're going to be continuing the discussion on scientific inference when we talk about scientific theories and what evidence for scientific theories we have and how that evidence might contribute to progress or development of scientific theories. The basis for scientific theorizing and knowledge obviously are data retrieved from experiment and observation, and that's going to be what we are looking at in week 3. Afterwards, in week 4, we're going to be looking more into explanation. First, law-based explanation and what laws of nature, first of all, are, and second of all, how they contribute to explanation, and why a law-based account of explanation might be problematic. Before then, in the 5th week, we turn towards causal explanations and explanations that are more graph-theoretic or based on Bayesian accounts of explanation. In the week after that, we're going to be looking at reduction, levels, and integration. And the question we are mainly going to be focusing on in that session is, how do special sciences investigating different domains relate to one another? And how can they be brought together? In week 7, then we're going to focus on a modern account of scientific explanation, namely mechanistic explanation, which are arguably the most empirically adequate explanations we currently have in the philosophy of science. Then we're going to be talking about to what extent science approximates an objective reality or truth in our session on realism versus anti-realism. In week 9, we're going to be talking about models in science, and I'm going to introduce you to a bunch of different models being used, and also to the question, to what extent is a model-based science helpful, and what can models contribute to scientific progress. I'm also going to be looking into the issue of generality versus specificity in models in this week. And then after that, we're going to focus a little bit more on scientific progress and change. We're coming back to some of the themes from the very beginning here, but we're going to be extending the discussion to modern debates about scientific progress and change in light of what we've heard about modern accounts of explanation, realism, and models. And then in the final week of this lecture, we're going to be situating philosophy of science in a broader context, talking about politics, values, and science critics. We're going to be covering stuff like biases, for instance, gender bias, the replication crisis, but also some stuff on values and norms. The question behind this session is going to be who drives science and what could be problematic about that. And in the end, we're going to have a final exam. So with that, I finish the overview and I turn to what's called intended learning outcomes. So what do I want to achieve with this lecture? What is it that I want you to take away from this lecture? Well, I already told you a little bit about the basics of philosophy of science. I want you to take away that this is interesting stuff. I want to cover some ground. I want you to get introduced to the field, of course, but my main aim is to really empower you. I want you to become familiar with key questions and concepts in the philosophy of science, such as explanation, law, reduction, causality, and so forth. I want you to enter into discussion of classical as well as contemporary accounts, both with me and with your peers. I want you to get an overview and be ready to delve deeper. So to pick yourself a seminar maybe that's in philosophy of science, and then have some background knowledge and really go into something that intrigues you. Pick something where you feel like, oh, this is cool, I want to discuss more, and now I actually know the background against which I have to do the readings. I also want to train your philosophical thinking, and this is not something I can do while you are passive. It needs your participation, it needs your action as well. And ideally, it's even fun. Well, over and above, I also want you to improve your analytical skills, to train your critical thinking, and to use structured imagination to solve philosophical problems. This is really sort of a finger exercise, and for the most part throughout this lecture there are going to be discussion questions for you to discuss among your peers. There are going to be little test questions where you can already see how much you have become familiar with the debate. And over and above, I really want you to learn to learn. Take advantage of peer-to-peer interactions, even in this online semester, and just make the most of it. That said, you may wonder, well, if she wants to empower us, why does she teach this class in English? Why the heck does it have to be in English? She isn't even a native speaker. Yeah, true, I'm not a native speaker. But first of all, English is just the international research language of our time. Secondly, many of the contemporary debates we're going to be covering aren't even held in German, so there's no actual translation, and it's just weird to start and try translate it for a lecture, and then when you look back at the literature, you don't find the terms, or there is no standard translation, and it's all weird. Thirdly, Zerland University is an international university, and I think it's well worth reaching out to international students from many subject areas. So this is another reason why I'm giving this lecture in English. Besides, it prepares you for your seminars, where you'll be reading English literature for the most part, and it empowers you for your international career in academia outside. That said, both Lisa and myself are happy to answer questions in German if need be. So essentially, again, it's all about empowering you. Now on to some resources. If you checked out the notes and the description of the course, you might have noticed that the lecture is not based on a single book, but rather on a corpus of traditional as well as recent literature. So there are 4 main books that I list as resources for this course. They are all available in the library, either online or in print. And I recommend buying at least 1 or 2 of them, so you can also look stuff up at home on demand. just briefly, the one on the very left is an introduction to philosophy of science from the Oxford Very Short Introduction series by Sami Okasha. It's very nice, very condensed, very tiny. You can carry it around easily. It gives a good overview of a lot of the topics we're covering, but is a bit short on some of them. Then the big one in the middle here, Philosophy of Science Key Concepts by Stephen French, is a very nice, easy read introduction for students who haven't yet covered any lectures or classes in the field. It's very accessible, and I highly recommend, if you have to pick just one book, I highly recommend you to get that one. Then there is Laut&Sereiter, wissenschaftliche Erkenntnis. It's the only one that I list here that's in German. And it's more history and figure-based than the others, but it's a nice complement. It's not really a recommendation as a go-alone book. And then there is Alan Chalmers's What is the Thing Called Science? It's also a small book, easy to carry around. Not as easy a read as the key concepts, and also not as up-to-date as either Okasha or French. So my personal hierarchy of orders would be French, Okasha, Chalmers, and then Laut&Sereiter. For all of the books, I'm going to give you the chapters that I used for the lectures, or that you can consult as background reading for the lectures. And of course, another typical question I usually get when teaching in English is, can I read in German? Of course you can. Well, why not? But I don't necessarily recommend you doing that. Why? Well, because sometimes translations just aren't great, and it's enough of a challenge to master the subject-specific vocabulary in one language. So my recommendation would be for you to rather discuss in German with your peers, but actually read the English literature, read the English books, while we're also having the lecture in English. The nice effect of that could be that you have a distinction between subject and meta-language. Sometimes that ends up in pretty awful Dinglish, but at the same time, it gives you a good way to handle a lot of specific terms, and it's also a chance to get at concepts freshly without assuming connotations that you have as a native speaker, because you sometimes don't have the same connotations in a foreign language. So take it as a chance, not so much a challenge. So while we're at this, I can give you some more logistics of how this lecture will be working. So first of all, if you're seeing this video, then you have already discovered that you have videos listed on my website under Philosophy of Science. You find them from teaching, like in the header you pick teaching, then student resources, and then Philosophy of Science. You will need a password that I'm going to put on Moodle. What I suggest you to do is, while you watch each video, is to take notes and be interactive. You can stop videos at any time and just take some time to think things through. You can rewind, you can look at things again, you can Google something, but also take notes on what's important. And at the end of each video, I suggest that you compile what I would call a most important slide for yourself. So think about what would you put on your slide if you were to have just one slide summarizing the most important things from this lecture. You'll notice that I don't usually have a summary slide in my lectures, and that's intentional because I want you to think about what you would put on a summary slide. It's part of this being interactive. So be interactive. Yes, you can form groups, you can exchange with your peers. You're not alone, even in this online semester. You can work with others. In addition to this task of creating a most important slide, I set you some more tasks in the form of discussion questions that are going to be discussed in teams every week. We're going to put a channel for each week, and Lisa is going to moderate the discussions, sort of a replacement for a regular tutorial. And the channels will be open over the week, and then at the end of the week we'll close it and give you the next, open the next channel with discussion questions for the next lecture. In addition to that, we are gonna have live sessions for the tutorials. And Lisa is going to offer 3 of them, and I think she's going to just coordinate the dates with you. There's one going to be end of November, one in January, and then probably one shortly before the final exam. And yes, of course, there are also final exams. The dates are already set. There's a first exam on the 10th of February, 2021, and there's one on the 7th of April, 2021. So these are the weeks just after this semester and just before the next semester. We don't yet really know what the pandemic will allow us to do with respect to the exams, but we're hoping that we can actually just run them as usual. You register for the exams through LSF, and actually you can already suggest questions for the exam in Teams. So I'm going to create a channel there as well where you can put exam question suggestions. This, by the way, is another way to really learn and summarize the lecture materials for yourself. Create little exams, quizzes for one another, and then just submit nice questions as exam questions. And maybe I pick some of them. Maybe I like them. Let's see. All right, that's all for now. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to get in touch via Teams or via email. You can contact both Lisa and myself. Lisa is going to hold the tutorials, as I said, and I'm going to see you in the next video. Have fun, everyone!